discussed previously, to give us kind of your point of view on the WSIS process after the Tunis conference. Okay, we can start.
Okay. Well, the most interesting aspect, of course, coming out of a summit is its final communique. That is what remains. And one way of analyzing this final communique that has been developed by us at Diplo in a program which I had baptized and christened as Diplo Analytica about 7 years ago, was to track the documentary, the textual changes, taking the final communique as base and moving back, for example, if one had to focus on internet governance, to the PrepCom 3 Plus meeting of last Monday, 14th of November 2005. So one has, so to speak, two bookends to compare. The bookend of the PrepCom initial paper circulated by Ambassador Khan and the final communique signed up by the various heads of state or government or foreign ministers who were present here in Tunisia by the 18th of November. It is very, very interesting, instructive, didactic, and perhaps also inspirational for those of us who are that dedicated to textual analysis and comparisons, to find out not only where the extra comma or where the extra qualification has been introduced, but also to see the substantial changes which reflect diplomatic negotiations that went on during the week between Monday and not really Friday, but up to Wednesday. I can subdivide immediately on prima facie analysis of this document. It could be further analyzed. The sub-themes that occurred. The first was, of course, the whole question as to the anchoring of the Internet Governance Forum function. Where would it be anchored? And the anchoring, of course, was being debated. At the one end, there was the very soft approach of saying it could be anchored in the Internet Society, to which the harder line delegates were suggesting, with a bit of sarcasm, why not anchor it in Microsoft? At the other end, of course, the hardliners were pushing for this to be anchored fully and comprehensively inside the United Nations. And one can see this substantial debate as to how the follow-up to the WSIS would carry on, namely the anchoring of its institutional follow-up, coming out in the change of words that you have between the Monday draft of PrepCom 3 and the final summit communique. In the Monday draft you will find the words that we call upon the UN Secretary General to establish, to create an intergovernmental forum. At the end, we find, instead of establish and create, we call upon the United Nations Secretary General to convene a meeting. Now, this gives us an essential difference, a contrast in effect, between to establish, and establish could be understood to imply under UN auspices, to the mere convening of, which could be a touch-and-go affair by the Secretary General coming over for 25 minutes, declaring the forum open and leaving it to waddle in its own terms and conditions of existence. Now that is already telling us a lot about the various interests involved in the follow-up to this WSIS. At one end you have those who want the Internet Governance Forum to be firmly anchored in the United Nations as part of the United Nations, implying also some kind of United Nations intergovernmental oversight over all of the Internet. At the other end, there is this idea that the forum will just go on discussing various matters for at least the next 5 years. And this brings us to the second aspect, the question of the timing. The timing in the Monday draft was originally 5 years. It was debated by the softliners as to how this could be reduced to perhaps 1 year, but then the hardliners suggested rather saucily, if not cockily, that this would mean that perhaps every 1 year there would be political oversight over, say, ICANN. A review, an annual review by an intergovernmental body of what ICANN was doing. And so that suggestion of the annual, yearly extension was quickly withdrawn, and we have the 5-year limit, which might even be extended by a further 5 years, ultimately for the United Nations General Assembly itself to have an overview in 2015, and this is also mentioned in the final communiqué. But in speaking about these first two themes, namely anchoring and timing, one is missing a much more substantial strand of negotiations that went on, which I will put in as a third critical element. Between Monday and Wednesday in the PrepCom 3+, you have the insertion of two rather significant Latin words, inter alia. So when we are seeing that here the heads of state are calling upon the Secretary General of the United Nations to convene the Internet Governance Forum, there is another track which is also institutional, quasi-institutional, semi-institutional, namely the enhanced cooperation track. And this is why inter alia was introduced by the final communiqué, which we don't find in the PrepCom draft circulated on Monday afternoon, namely that now we have not only the Internet Governance Forum to be convened by the UN Secretary General by not later than the second quarter of 2006, and there again one must also remark that there is another clause which says that this has to be actually meeting not later than 2006, so we have to still work out which is the prevailing of those two clauses. But we have, apart from the Internet Governance Forum track, we have the track of enhanced cooperation. And inter alia also allows other tracks to be put together. But let's leave the other tracks for now. The enhanced cooperation track is very interesting because in the Monday PrepCom 3 draft, this was in nearly a preambular aspect of the draft. It wasn't so operative. Now it is fully operative, and it comes under the chapeau of inter alia follow-ups to WSIS. And this enhanced cooperation is calling upon, that is the states, the governments, members of the United Nations, are here in Tunisia calling upon all those organizations which have some control, some influence, or are related to the critical infrastructure, critical resources of the Internet, to come along and make part of this general overview. Now, this is waffle, if you like, but it is there. And there is a track which is established. And I am sure that this is going to be seen as a success, if you like, for the hardliners, that they have some handle on which to put their hopes on to open the possibilities of discussing further that aspect which is explicitly excluded in the final communique, where it says no oversight is going to be allowed. So there again you have a potential contradiction inside the own terms. Now this obviously takes us another step further than anchoring, timing and the inter alia establishment of the different tracks of the follow-up. It takes us to the media appreciation of what we have been seeing. And one can mention that very early, midweek, the BBC and some other news media internationally were already proclaiming that the US won in the summit because ICANN has avoided being subjected to any oversight. Now, this is also interesting to introduce into the analysis of the changes from the PrepCom 3 paper of Monday afternoon till the final communique being released on the Friday. Because the media itself had a way of sealing, of coagulating the more loose arrangements that were still being put together between Monday and Wednesday, and then between Wednesday and Friday. So by proclaiming through the media, the BBC is worldwide, through the media that the US had won a victory at this summit, it kind of sealed the possibility of some last-minute exercise in diplomacy during the summit itself, either by some foreign minister or head of state or government, to reopen, say, the oversight function, to reopen, say, the timing function, to reopen, say, the anchoring function which we are discussing here. And the importance of the media, I think, is rather interesting to also relate to our analysis of these two documents. So what we are doing in Diplo Analytica is to compare, first of all, the Monday PrepCom initial paper with the final communique of the heads of state and government and/or government. This is a short exercise because the changes, although quite substantive, as I have been saying, are not that radical. But it gives you an idea of what can be achieved for a number of different purposes. First of all, if we take the clock back, we can, after analyzing all the relevant differences between the Monday and the Friday of this week, between the 14th and the 18th of November, then slide the clock back, so to speak, and analyze the differences between June and the 18th of November. June with the release of the working group on Internet governance paper. That is another exercise. How far, therefore, and this is a question at a secondary level, at a second time frame level, instead of just comparing this week, how far was the Wiggins report last June reflected in the final communique now? One can also extend the time frame further back and go to the Geneva 2003 final communique and compare and contrast how far did the Geneva Declaration of Principles and the plan of action, the action plan, get implemented in the Tunisia final communique and the Tunis commitment. So there again we can compare and contrast how much the interests that were reflected, A, in the WSIS 1 final communique, B, in the Wiggins report this year, how much these came through, survived, or were completely amended in the final communique on the 18th of November. Now this is important, as I said, for different purposes. This is not just a pedant who is just examining which words changed. No, it's substantive. We want to be able to track how the interests have been satisfied or over-satisfied, perhaps in some cases. Perhaps ICANN can say that in Tunisia it has been over-satisfied, and therefore other interests were under-satisfied. What balance of interests do we have in the final communique in Tunisia, which is different from the balance of interests sealed by the Geneva final communique and by the Wiggins working paper, final paper that was presented in June? The importance of this is to see how the trade-offs were diplomatically negotiated and what compromises were made. Who gave what up? For what in exchange? After doing that internally, inside the meeting in Tunisia, inside the working group, inside the Geneva summit, we can then check how those interests have changed over time And also check, and this is most important in diplomatic operations, to check whether there might have been a trade-off between the negotiating table on the information society, with, say, the trade talks coming up in Hong Kong, whether we have a trade-off between WSIS and, say, WTO, or WSIS and WHO. And this is going to be important now, not only to look back at the future, we look back into it, looking back into the past, we look back into the past to be able to draw lessons for the future, and not just moral lessons, but fundamental lessons of the balance of interests. What is this balance of interests? The point here is that in, say, 3 years' time, in 6 years' time, there are going to be, by definition, some changes in the circumstances. The circumstances will never be the same in a year's time, in 2, in 6 years' time. With the change of circumstances that will occur inevitably with the passage of time, we will have the potential of some compromises that have been reached already in Geneva and here in Tunisia, having their foundations changed, in fact, because of the change in circumstances. And some other compromises becoming totally superseded by events. Now, if that is the case, then the text, the only survivor, so to speak, from 03 and 05, will be reflecting a different reality, therefore opening up the potential for a renegotiation, even merely to readjust to the new circumstances. Additionally, there will also be new demands developing because of new circumstances, and those will be injected into this text, and when they hit the text, they will be hitting it and hitting the most vulnerable parts of it, which will have become more unstable, more precarious, less grounded in reality than they were 2 years ago or now, when we come to renegotiating elements of it. And so it is only through an understanding, a deep understanding of the underlying swaps and trade-offs that have taken place internally here in Tunisia, in the working group on internet governance, in the Geneva final communique, it's only through a deeper understanding of the links, if you like, and what made one delegation accept this compromise and that delegation accept this compromise, that we will be able to have some good counsel, some wiser approach to any renegotiations which will occur in the future. And it is for this purpose that Diplo Analytica is so useful. Through Diplo Analytica, we will be able to attribute paternity of the main clauses. For example, the inter alia clause that I was referring to. Who was the father of that clause? That is important to see, because the text itself doesn't say it, because it's just one composite text. So what we are doing in Diplo Analytica is to dissect the document, open it up, so to speak, to look at its underlying layer and see the paternity of each of the critical clauses that we have. By understanding who was pushing, who was advancing the inter alia clause, the anchoring in the UNSG, the convening clause, we will be able to know how much that government will still be attached to that clause in, say, 5 years' time, when we come to review all that has happened. And perhaps there will be a change of government, a change of policy in that particular state that was represented advancing this particular clause. And so it will be more loose then, instead of being firmly founded as a prima facie superficious analysis of the text itself. Also, not only by attributing paternity, but, as I have been saying, to analyze the interests that are being articulated and advanced. We want to see whether those interests are still held up with the same intensity, with the same value that they were held up here in Tunis when we meet again, say, in 5 years' time. Because a lowering or an increasing of interest of attributing value to certain clauses, to certain principles, will mean that, again, there will be scope for renegotiation. So an analysis of the balance of interests now is important, so we will have taken stock of the interests as they are now, for the record, for when we come up again in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years' time to renegotiate. I mentioned also the media. The media aspect, I think, is rather important, because we will also be seeing how the media had an influence in affecting the final outcome in Geneva, in WGIG, and here also. And to wrap all this up, it will also be useful for us to try and understand what diplomatic levers were exerted, which levers were utilized by which organizations in Geneva in 2003, during the working group on Internet governance last June, and here in Tunisia. Will those levers still be as strong in 2010, in 2015? And this is why we must take stock of the levers and their strength as of today, so that in the future, in trying to assess whether those levers can be utilized or not, one can already see what weaponry, if you like, what diplomatic weaponry the various states that were protagonists here in Tunisia can exert, with which diplomatic levers they can utilize, and we will know what their armory consists of. Finally, it's important also to take stock of the various alliances through an analysis of, obviously, who was supporting who in PrepComs, who was aligning himself with which country on which clauses as of today. And alliances wouldn't be alliances if they did not shift over time. And so taking stock of the present day alliances, keeping that on the record, is important for when we come again in the future to analyze the possibilities of renegotiation by immediately being able to list the previous alliances on this crucial clause and seeing whether that alliance still holds in 5 years' time, whether it is weaker in 5 years' time, whether it is stronger in 5 years' time, and whether the counter alliance, just to simplify and put the whole summit into two camps, which is an oversimplification, but in order to understand better, we will take stock of the counter-alliance and see in 5 years' time if that counter-alliance is stronger or weaker, and where the states, where the representatives have moved on each different clause of the list of critical clauses. This way we will be putting the text into context. And that, I think, is very important for diplomatic analysis. So we start off by focusing on the text, by focusing merely at a superficial level at the words which have changed within 1 week. Then we dissect by going underneath the text, checking the interests, checking the paternity of the clauses which have changed, of the critical clauses, checking also how the diplomatic compromises have been achieved, what has been given up in exchange of what, because that might be relevant again in 3 years' time. If one particular clause has been given up over here, it might be revived in 3 years' time in a different context, where it will be more easy to persuade the other alliance that that clause makes sense. So all that has been discarded in Geneva, in Tunisia, is still close enough to the text in a proper analysis and not thrown away forever. So one has to include in this wider contextual analysis the discarded clauses, because they will still be, in a way, semi-alive, trying to make their way back into the text in 3 years' time. And those alliances which manage to get either stronger leverage or stronger allies will manage to bring those in. So it's important for us to avoid being surprised in an ugly manner to see which were the clauses which were dropped out and keep them within our larger contextual vision of the text we have before us. In other words, what Diplo Analitica gives us is a proper analysis of diplomatic documents and not merely a superficial look at the document. The document is rich if one goes into its hypertext analysis. And Diplo Analitica gives you that. It gives you this analysis of the paternity of the crucial clauses. It gives you this analysis of the interests. It gives you this link to how the diplomatic compromise was achieved, what was left out, what was discarded in exchange for something else being included, what the diplomatic levers were in order to arrive at this conclusion, what alliances there were between the various states in this exercise of multilateral diplomacy over the last 2.5 years, what the media influence was, what the other organizations' influence was. Here in WSIS, if you go into the final declaration both in Geneva and here in Tunisia and click on find and see how many times multi-stakeholder was introduced into the text, you will find an enormous number. I haven't yet done that, but I've seen this so many times over the document that it must be the first time that multi-stakeholder in a UN summit document is repeated so many times. And the multi-stakeholder interests of each different stakeholder makes it more relevant for us in this contextual analysis. And this way one can understand how the multi-stakeholders were aligned around one group of states or another group of states on this clause and not on the other clause, but perhaps on yet another clause. And again, those stakeholders' interests might be changing over time, their leverage might be changing over time, so it's important for us to keep on keeping track of these interests in each of the various clauses that we have in the final text. This brings us, therefore, to an appreciation which is much fuller than the superficial not even analysis, but just discussion of what is in the text. And this is an exercise which we have carried out regarding various other diplomatic agreements, and which here beckons us, because of the continuing process, to carry out in full in advance of the Internet Governance Forum to be held in Athens in 2006.